Well, hello and welcome back to the CEO interview series here with Jill Campbell. Jill is, the former director of ITSG, Program Management Office at Belcan, currently doing a bunch of real interesting independent consulting work. So, Jill, welcome back again, and let's jump into segment two here. Segment two, we're talking about managing data as a product, and we're talking about the root cause of some of the problems and the hurdles, and then the solution related to that. In the first segment, we chatted about the problems that you had encountered at Belcan. And now, as we shift gears to discuss the root cause that you put and the solution that you put into place, let me kick off by saying, what did you see as being root causes and issues which led to the data problems that you had?
Sure. I think there's multiple symptoms that contributed to the root cause. I think the biggest thing is the oversimplification of understanding data, right? It's real simple. We have all these systems and we put information in them, and somehow we believe that IT is the miracle workers and it's all going to come out and it's going to be exactly what we want it to be, right? We look at tools like Power BI that is going to be the window to the world, and we put in a lot of effort and we put in a lot of solutioning and the vision of it's going to be the window to the world and everything's going to be perfect when we build it. So we actually did this. We put in the time and effort, and we did the art of the possible and all the right things to be able to put in Power BI that is going to let us see our data and in a great way, and partnered with the right people, with our finance team and with some of our HR team to be able to map out good dashboards and self-service. And guess what? It still looked like crud because the data, right, was never curated, and it was the same window, right, or it was a different window to the same data. And all of a sudden, people were looking at this going, well, I still don't know what's right. I still have to export it. I still have to pull it into a spreadsheet, and I still have to manipulate it, to make sure my numbers are right. And that was the challenge. We kept escalating and saying, hey, guess what, guys? If we don't fix the data, it really doesn't matter, right? It's a dress on a pig. It's the same stuff. So we had to take the step back and say, okay, who are the people in the finance team that are going to know if the data is correct? And they said, well, we don't know where the data comes from. And we said, well, who's going to know where the data comes from? Well, isn't that you? Well, how would we know? How would IT know if the data is good? And it became kind of that banter, what chicken and egg, right? Which way it comes. So we took a step back, and what I proposed was to do a full process mapping, right? So when we talked to a lot of different pieces, people within the organization, we looked at onboarding. And when I talked to a lot of different organizations or different departments for a lot of different reasons, everybody was working on our onboarding problem. Right. This group didn't like this piece of it. Our recruiting department needed this. Everybody had a hand into it, which meant to me that nobody was solving the problem. Right. Which is typical. So I partnered with an organization who is very good at data governance. And I said, hey, we need some help process mapping. And we started from the very beginning, all the way from recruiting. Right. Because if our product is people, which it is, we need to understand how people come in. We need to understand how they become an employee. We need to understand, the pieces in between, how they get benefits, all those good things. And guess what? We need to also understand how they exit. And we also need to understand how it's refreshed, because if we have a skills and we need them again, we're also bringing them back in, right? So we had some other challenges that we were trying to solve at the same time. So it made sense to go end to end and map all this out. While we were doing that under the guise of data governance, we also were then able to say, hey, who owns the pieces of the data at all of those pivotal points, right? So if we have a system that is bringing in the recruiting pieces, and that is going to tie into our HR system, and that is going to tie into our back-end ERP system, which is then going to be able to produce financial reports, which is then going to be able to let the Power BI give us the information we need. We now can then start identifying data product owners. And then we have to teach them how they become gatekeepers, right? Because once you identify all these people, we want to make sure that we put gatekeepers in place to make sure the data can then be curated and stay good. So we were able to do the process mapping to be able to see the end-to-end points where the data was coming in, right? So we know where the data is coming from. We then can start understanding why are we getting conflicts, right? We had two systems that were actually providing two different employee numbers. So when the finance was trying to count how many employees, well, they have this type of employees in this system, or they have this type of employees in this system. And we identified that we had 12 different employee types. And we actually had one employee type that was a single person. So they actually created an employee type for one person instead of an exception. And I don't know if that was really a surprise, but it was a surprise to a lot of people because they're like, okay, now how do we count? And that was really where we took a step back and said, okay, guys, we need to either make some changes to the systems. We need to actually, start consolidating. We need to either reduce the number of employee types, or we need to be able to identify them when we do our counts, right? So we were now starting to peel back the onion and understand really where some of those problems began, right? And that way we can start looking at root causes of why our data was not good. Once we're able to do that, you can start putting ownership to and creating product owners, data product owners, to be able to help keep data clean. Because even when you start identifying the problem, right, if we fix it, we don't want to fix it once and walk away, because it's going to propagate every time, right? Because if it's downstream, even if we fix it here, the next time it runs again, if we got a problem upstream, it's going to come back to that every time. That was where the communication really was key. And we had to make sure that between IT fixing the system for one group, then had to communicate with another person or another department to be able to talk about where their problems were and what their downstream impact was. It was interesting because there were some challenges HR would find a miss, right? Okay, I found out this person's employee identification or employee type was wrong, and they just go in and fix it. And I said, okay, time out, guys. Why are you fixing it in that system? If we determine this is the system of record and you're fixing it there, you're now impacting this every single time. So we had to start talking about change control, and we had to start talking about who owned what piece of data. And we started having to talk about sequence of data and how that moved through. So the true curation process was needing to be documented. And while we had this end-to-end process documented, we could then lay it out and use that as an artifact every time any change happened anywhere. And it was massive and it was intimidating. We had to start breaking it out in pieces that people could actually understand and take back to their teams and be able to help in those little segmented units. And then we start talking about what data product owners' responsibilities were to be able to educate, be able to make that their vocabulary, and be able to, really start making data itself as a day-to-day conversation. Make sure that's part of the culture. And that is the biggest part of the change in any organization. If that is not an everyday conversation, and if that is not how we behave throughout our day-to-day activities, and if that's not a concern in anything we're doing, we're going to continue to propagate the problem, right? We're always going to continue to make this big, huge mess even bigger. and we're not going to be able to, work with IT. We're not going to be able to work with the business to be able to solve it, to have good data, to make good decisions, because that's really the ultimate goal, right? We want to be able to have data that means something so the executives can go make a good decision. We wanted our CEO to be able to know how many employees he had in a certain capacity. So does he go bid on this contract, or does he have enough people to report for this certain entity? Those numbers are pivotal if that's what your business is.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, it's a massive program, massive undertaking to get all those people together as well.
Absolutely.
I'm curious about the way that you implemented that data governance program, and how it really led to addressing the issues. If you could maybe just unpack it a little bit more for us around, you mentioned data ownership. And you've got all these different facets of ownership. And were there multiple people involved in owning, or was it like when it comes to employee, like was there one person that owned employee and then multiple people within that owner's team that were owning different facets of it, or how is it kind of structured, the ownership side within data governance?
Sure. So it's a work in progress, right? So
Okay.
When I left the organization, that's where we were. We were starting to identify what those products were going to be and what the level of responsibilities were going to be. But it absolutely is a single owner, just like in Agile, right? You have a single owner for that product, but you obviously have people who are going, the hands-on people who are going to be working with that data, but you have to have a single owner, right? Who's got to be that decision maker. And it follows the same practices as an Agile methodology, because you've got to have the accountability in there, and the education. So it follows definitely those same practices, which I found really fascinating, because as I was going through some training that I was fortunate to receive, I kept coming back to the professor and I said, "This sounds like Agile." And he would just grin. And I said, "This sounds like Agile." And he would just grin. And over and over, each piece of it, the creation, the identification, the method, because it really is, and all the steps through there. And we have to be cognitive of working with the business, and with IT professionals on exactly what you're asking about. Who has what responsibility, what are their roles, and what is their accountability pieces, because that way we can make sure that they know the verbiage, they know the accountability requirements for themselves, so they can say, no, that's not going to work in our area, or they can pull, they can blow the whistle when something isn't right, because they know that they want it to make sure it's good going downstream. And that product owner then can be part of that big team of making sure data is good. But when you're looking at building out a data governance program, it is a really company-wide initiative. You've got to have the right stakeholders, et cetera, in there. And when you're identifying those problems, you've got to have a lot of players involved in there to be able to make sure that you're calling out the right responsibilities.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, and I think that sets us up very nicely for the segment 3, where we'll do a bit more of a deep dive into the work in progress and what's going on there around the data governance program. So thanks for that. And to the audience, remember, this was segment 2 you've just watched. Make sure that if you missed segment 1, go back and check that out, and then come back and join us in segment 3. We'll see you shortly.